Committee will come to order. Good morning and welcome to today's markup. Today our committee is moving forward with our efforts to repeal Obamacare and replace the failing law with patient-centered solutions. As we've said throughout this effort, repealing and replacing Obamacare must be done through a step-by-step process. With the House passage of the American Health Care Act, we're well on our way to providing Americans with relief from Obamacare and a 21st century health care system that puts patients and families in control, not Washington. As the Senate now considers the AHCA, we're pushing forward on a parallel track to advance legislation that protects and expands Americans' access to patient-centered care. Today, our committee will consider three bills that all focus on this important goal. Our first bill is H.R. 2372, the Veteran Act, sponsored by Social Security Subcommittee Chairman Sam Johnson. This legislation takes important action to ensure continued access to private health insurance options for the men and women who, like Mr. Johnson himself, have served and sacrificed in defense of our great nation. The bill puts into law an existing regulation which allows veterans who are eligible for but not enrolled in VA health care to access tax credits offered under current law and the tax credits provided by the AHCA when they take effect. This will provide our veterans with financial support and greater flexibility to access health plans that best meet their needs. Our second bill today is H.R. 2579, the Broader Options for Americans Act, sponsored by Health Subcommittee Chairman Pat Tiberi. This bill expands financial support for the purchase of health insurance for certain Americans who have lost their group coverage, often because they've lost their job. It does so by allowing these Americans who are eligible for COBRA continuation coverage, who face higher costs and no direct financial support from their employer, to access the AHCA's tax credit. Additionally, it ensures that Americans who have similar coverage and work at churches or other houses of worship can access these credits. Finally, we have H.R. 2581, the Verify First Act, sponsored by Congressman Lou Barletta. This legislation takes important action to protect taxpayer dollars from fraud, waste, and abuse. It prevents the AHCA's monthly tax credits and Obamacare's current subsidies from being dispensed until the legal status of an eligible recipient can be verified. The Verify First Act strengthens existing verification tools by making a common sense change. Rather than sending the money first and checking legal status later, which Obamacare does now, it verifies legal status up front. As we've seen with so many federal programs, it's all but impossible to get fraudulently claimed money back after it's already out the door. The best solution is to stop waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer dollars before it occurs, and that's exactly what this bill does. I want to thank all the members who crafted the legislation before us today. These are important solutions that expand access to care for the American people and safeguard taxpayer dollars. And I hope they'll receive the bipartisan support they deserve today. With that, I'll now yield to Ranking Member Neal for his opening remarks. Mr. Neal.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, recently the House passed a bill that would take away health insurance from 24 million Americans, raise premiums and out-of-pocket costs on millions more, take away coverage guarantees, place an age tax on older Americans, and if that's not enough, raise Medicare. Middle-class Americans would be on the front line of these cuts, while the proposal provides substantial tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires, at the upper end up to $7 million a year to the 400 richest Americans. Let's be clear. The Republican plan that we voted on earlier this month was nothing more than a tax cut disguised as a health care bill. What's worse, the majority chose to pass it without fully understanding its impact on the American people. Even as we sit here today, we still have not heard from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office about the legislation's impact. This is not the way we should be approaching an issue that is so important to the American people. Nevertheless, today we are here marking up three bills intended to fix problems in the Republican ACA repeal bill. Mr. Johnson's bill is designed to fix a problem in Trump care that affects veterans, But the underlying Republican health care bill would dramatically cut Medicaid, a program that provides health care for nearly 2 million veterans. And the President's recently released budget takes it a step further by cutting veterans programs, including disability benefits. Mr. Teaberry's bill would allow individuals purchasing COBRA coverage to receive tax credits, but older Americans are more likely to rely upon COBRA, and the Republican Trump Care bill would allow insurers to charge older Americans up to 5 times what they charge younger Americans. Mr. Barletta's bill would essentially address a non-existent problem regarding Social Security numbers. However, it would make it more difficult for certain Americans, infants and domestic violence victims, to acquire health care coverage. None of these bills fix the harm that was caused by the Republican health care bill, and we still don't have a CBO or JCT score. In fact, 2 of these bills only take effect if the Republican Trump Care bill takes effect, which we know will not occur since the Senate has pronounced the House bill dead on arrival in the Senate. This is a charade. Even if all 3 of these bills were incorporated into the Trump Care legislation, they would not undo the terrible cuts in the bill. Enormous coverage losses, more than $800 billion in cuts to Medicaid, unraveling of an important consumer protection, and certainly cuts programs designed to help address the opiate addiction crisis in my state of Massachusetts and throughout the nation. Everyone in this room this morning has someone close to them that they know who has an opiate addiction, and Medicaid is now a program that middle-class Americans rely on for long-term care. Thanks to Medicare and Medicaid, your parents are not living in your attic. Republicans can try to distract from the devastation Trump Care would do to working families, but this morning we all know better. If Republicans are serious about addressing middle-class American health care needs, they would go back to the drawing board, start over, and work with us. And I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Our first order of business is H.R. 2372, the Veterans Equal Treatment Ensures Relief and Access Now Act, and the committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 2372. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in the nature of substitute which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and consider base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Barthold, the Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Neal. Members of the committee, you have before you 2 joint committee documents, JCX 21 and 22, which describe the underlying legislation, H.R. 2372, and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. Very briefly, under present law, an individual who's eligible for health coverage that meets minimum essential coverage from a source other than the individual insurance market, as a general matter, may not receive premium assistance credits. Under certain government programs, such as those offered by the Department of Veterans Affairs, individuals may be eligible for minimum essential coverage. However, Treasury regulations have provided, in the case of one of the designated Veteran Affairs health programs, that an individual is not considered eligible for such coverage unless actually enrolled in the program. That is, the individual would be eligible for premium assistance credits. The legislation before you would codify this rule under which an individual is not considered eligible for coverage under a designated Veteran Affairs health program unless actually enrolled. The Chairman's amendment in the nature of substitute, in addition to making some technical clarifications, modifies the legislation to provide that with respect to the Affordable Care Act, that these provisions apply for taxable years after December 31st, 2013, and with respect to the American Health Care Act, should it be enacted, it would apply to taxable years after December 31st, 2019. That concludes my brief description. Be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Mr. Barthold, As we begin questions about the amendment in the nature of substitute, does this bill codify in statute existing regulations promulgated under President Obama?
Yes, it does. That was the point I tried to emphasize, Mr. Chairman, that under present law, Treasury regulations make clear that under a designated Veteran Affairs program, an individual would be eligible for premium assistance credits,
So
notwithstanding
this
eligibility.
makes no changes, but continues the current practice for veterans.
Exactly, sir.
So I noticed that when Leader Pelosi claimed that 7 million veterans will lose their tax credit under the Republican health bill, the Washington Post fact-checked it and gave it 3 Pinocchios as just simply being a false claim. I think that's important. I think today we all, Republicans, Democrats, embrace our veterans, want to make sure their current existing coverage continues. Are there questions for Mr. Barthold? Mr. Neal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, I'm looking at the bill and I'm looking at the tax code, and the amendments to the code in this bill don't seem to line up with the current version of the tax code. I can't find the current law that this bill is amending. Mr. Barthold, does this bill amend what's in the tax code presently as it is in law today? Could you give me a quick yes or no on that?
Yes, it does, Mr. Neal.
Mr. Barthold, are the estimates that you are presenting compare these policies to current law?
Excuse me?
Are the estimates that you are presenting compare these policies to current law?
Oh, yes. All the estimates that we provide to members are relative to present law baseline, so relative to current law.
But these bills do not amend current law, is that correct?
No, the bill does amend current law by codifying. It does not change the substance or the action of the law. It amends the Internal Revenue Code to codify a Treasury regulation.
But unless the AHCA becomes law, this bill doesn't do anything.
With respect to the second aspect of the legislation before you, it would make no change unless the AHCA becomes law.
Thank you,
correct,
Mr. Chairman.
Other questions for Mr. Barthold? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Ms. Chu, you're recognized.
I still have questions for Mr. Barthold.
So, Ms. Chu, excuse me, Ms. Chu.
Yes, I still have questions for Mr. Barthold.
Oh, sure. Can I make a point before we do turn to debate? And without objection, I'd like to enter a statement from the bill sponsor, Representative Sam Johnson, into the record. Ms. Chu, you're recognized for questioning Mr. Barthold.
Mr. Barthold, how many veterans currently have coverage through the marketplaces?
I don't know. We'd have to undertake some research. It hasn't been relevant to the analysis of this bill since it's a codification of a regulation.
Well, how many veterans have coverage through Medicaid?
Again, I'd have to do some additional research, and I'll see if I can get that information for you.
See, I'm trying to understand all of the effects of the AHCA and this new bill on the American people and on veterans in particular. My understanding is that nearly 2 million veterans rely on Medicaid for their coverage and care, and that more than 40% of working-age veterans with Medicaid had no other source of coverage. The Trump Care Bill, or AHCA, which is referenced in Mr. Johnson's legislation, will cut more than $839 billion from Medicaid. And President Trump's budget proposes to cut another $610 billion from Medicaid. Veterans rely on Medicaid for their needed care for physical rehabilitation, mental health services, substance abuse treatment, and regular visits to the doctor. So, Mr. Barthold, I've heard a number of members ask for an updated CBO and JCT score on the AHCAs that passed the House. Do you have an updated score since the bill passed the House of Representatives 3 weeks ago?
Well, I can't speak for the Congressional Budget Office. It is joint work with my colleagues and the Congressional Budget Office. Late last week, earlier this week, the Congressional Budget Office said they hoped to release a final report on the legislation today, probably later today. As part of the work on that legislation, the Joint Committee has separately estimated the tax provisions. It's part of what goes into the entire package. And after this markup concludes, and I have a chance to review that final material, the Joint Committee will be releasing that small piece of the analysis, and then that also feeds into the bigger analysis that the Congressional Budget Office hopes to release later today.
Do you have an estimate of the number of individuals who are veterans who could lose coverage under the AHCA, and how many of these people would be helped as a result of today's legislation dealing with veterans?
Okay. 2 points on that. This legislation makes no change with respect to veterans' eligibility for premium credits. So with respect to your question about how the AHCA may affect veterans in general, I'd have to refer that to probably some follow-up joint work between my colleagues and the Congressional Budget Office.
Would this bill, H.R. 2372, do anything to help veterans who lost Medicaid coverage under the AHCA?
Under the AHC, veterans would be able to use the subsidies permitted under the AHCA for purchase of insurance in the individual market. I'm not sure what the effects would be in terms of what people end up being covered under group plans as opposed to Medicaid, as opposed to purchases in the individual market. But veterans would be eligible to use the subsidies to purchase insurance in the marketplace.
Under current laws, the tax credit a consumer can get for coverage in the marketplace adjusted to account for affordability?
Excuse me, I didn't catch all your questions.
Is the tax credit that a consumer can get for coverage in the marketplace adjusted for affordability?
No, they're dollar credits based on age and income.
Okay, so under the HCA, is there an affordability test to access the tax credit? That is, does the Trump Care tax credit provide more assistance for veterans with very modest incomes?
Well, as I noted, the credits are income based.
Okay. Under current law, can older veterans be charged up to 5 times or maybe more for coverage in the individual marketplace?
Not under present law.
Under the Republican AHCA bill, H.R. 1628, could an older individual who is a veteran be charged up to 5 times the standard premiums or even more?
The AHCA would permit a 5-to-1 ratio, as you reported, Ms. Chu.
Thank you. All time has expired. Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Barthold, as I understand the bill that was passed through here to repeal Obamacare, if you were a veteran who was eligible to get coverage through the VA, but you wanted to go through the exchange and get your coverage outside the VA, you got no tax credit.
What this bill does, both with respect to present law and the AHCA, is it says that notwithstanding that a veteran might be considered eligible for care through the VA,
you would be able now to get
eligible to use the premium tax credits in the marketplace.
And this bill is appropriately called the Veterans Equal Treatment Act because the bill that was passed through here originally to repeal Obamacare did not provide equal treatment to some veterans. Is that correct?
With respect to this particular legislation, since it codifies the regulation, it's not it's not obvious that the regulation would have been overturned by the legislation.
The bill, as it passed, did not treat veterans the way it did other people. If you were eligible for VA coverage, you could not get any tax credits under the bill that our Republican colleagues went over and celebrated in the pep rally with President Trump at the White House. Veterans did not get treated like other people in that situation, and so they have proposed today a Veteran Equal Treatment Act because they passed a bill that didn't provide veterans equal treatment. And in addition to that, I want to be sure I understand what this bill that they are offering today to provide the equal treatment they refused to provide initially, whether it does really provide equal treatment for other veterans. If you are a veteran among the 340,000 nationally that benefited directly from Medicaid expansion, do you receive any assistance through this bill? Does it make it any more likely that you'll be able to get that care in the future?
Mr. Doggett, this bill addresses a narrower issue.
Narrow point. It doesn't address veterans who may be accessing care today through Medicaid that is about to be slashed dramatically.
This bill does not make amendments that affect the overall application or the overall operation of
I think
the
there are around,
AHCA.
according to my figures, about 1.75 million veterans, including 105,000 in Texas, that are covered under Medicaid in total, and they won't be affected by this bill or protected. And then what about the family members, the children of veterans who may get coverage through the Children's Health Insurance Program through CHIP? Do they gain any equal treatment from this bill?
Again, Mr. Doggett, this legislation doesn't address how the CHIP program interacts with the rest of the AHCA.
And what about those veterans who are concerned about their spouses, the 600,000 spouses that rely on Medicaid? Do the spouses of veterans, whether it's relying on Medicaid or going through the insurance exchange and getting tax credits, do those veteran spouses, the ones who sacrificed and had concern while their husband or wife was overseas putting their life on the line, do they get any equal treatment out of this bill?
The bill, as I'd noted, addresses the narrow issue of veteran eligibility and the opportunity for a veteran to make use of the premium tax credits that would be offered both under present law.
Finally, Mr. Barthold, before we had Obamacare, the fact that someone had been a veteran, had put their life on the line, could be considered as a risk factor in deciding how much of a premium a veteran or a veteran's family might be charged. And in fact, almost anything could be considered as a risk factor or as a pre-existing condition, particularly when it came to mental health services or substance abuse treatment. Is there anything in this bill that will prevent, once this new law becomes in effect, veterans from being charged more just because they've been a veteran?
H.R. 2372, as offered to be amended, does not affect any of the definitions of health care coverage or...
Thank you. My concern is they didn't get equal treatment when this bill was originally passed. It was celebrated at the White House, and they will not get equal treatment when this current bill is passed.
Mr. Marchant, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had the opportunity last week to meet with a group of veterans in an assisted living facility, a nice group of guys, and frankly, all the discussion that we've already had today about their coverage and not having coverage and the new ACA had them a little bit confused. So I really appreciate Mr. Johnson bringing forward the Veteran Act. It clarifies that these veterans are going to be eligible for these tax credits under the new health care bill. It clarifies that they're not going to have to be subject to an IRS bureaucrat to redecide whether they're going to be eligible. So I co-sponsored the act for that reason, and I appreciate the bill being brought forward. Yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Sewell, you're recognized to question Mr. Barthold. Thank
you, Mr. Chairman. While I applaud the majority's efforts to help our veterans through H.R. 2372 and improve the AHCA, these efforts do not go far enough in negating the devastating coverage losses, more than $800 billion in Medicaid cuts, and unraveling of coverage protections in the underlying bill. Countless veterans and their families rely on cost-sharing subsidies and premium tax credits to afford health care coverage and reduce out-of-pocket expenses. Yet the Republican bill eliminates these programs. The President and many who champion his repeal and replace bill through passage last month claim that they are making America great again. But with these cuts, I submit to you, America cannot be great again. Slashes to Medicaid, Medicare, and the health benefits that long provided health security for our citizens is quite important. Almost 2 million American veterans and 280,000 Alabamian veterans rely on Medicaid to obtain primary and specialty health services. While some veterans use Medicaid to supplement existing Medicare, VA, or TRICARE coverage, 40% of non-elderly veterans with Medicaid have no other source of health care insurance. Do not be fooled. If you cut Medicaid, we will be cutting critical services, even to our veterans. The uninsured rate among non-elderly veterans has fallen by 42% since the majority coverage provisions of the Affordable Care Act took effect in 2014. States that adopted the Medicare expansion have experienced the greatest gains, which is unfortunate for states like mine. Alabama did not expand Medicaid. In Alabama, 13,000 uninsured veterans would be covered today if our governor had expanded Medicaid. We should abandon every attempt to cut and cap Medicaid in all states. Mr. Chairman, while I have been in Congress, both my district and I have been served by several extraordinary individuals who have served our country overseas admirably. Today, we have 3 on our team that work with me every day, including a wounded warrior. I have to tell you, there's no one who has more commitment to our veterans than me. But I do have several concerns. So, Mr. Bartol, under the AHCA, it states that states can waive the essential health benefits, which include services such as emergency services, hospitalization, and mental health and substance use disorder services. So my question is, so if a non-VA eligible veteran on Medicaid who has PSTD lives in a state that waives the essential health care benefits under this AHCA, how will they access mental health services that they are now guaranteed?
Ms. Sewell, the legislation before you, as I noted earlier, doesn't address the issues of essential health services or qualifying insurance. A waiver does not necessarily mean total elimination of benefits. It could mean, relative to present law, where benefits cannot, certain benefits cannot be capped, that benefits could be offered, but at a lower level.
But only if the state wanted to provide those.
Again, as it does,
the waiver is
AHCA
totally up to the state as to whether it has it.
Does provide states discretion.
It does. So states like mine could choose to waive essential health benefits, and veterans could get swept up in that as well.
That could occur.
The other question I have is the AHCA allows states to apply a work requirement for non-disabled, non-elderly, non-pregnant adults under the Medicaid. Does this apply to veterans? And can states deny Medicaid coverage to veterans who appear to be able-bodied but suffer from PSTD? I'm getting to the work requirement that is in the repeal and replace bill.
Ms. Sewell, I'll have to apologize. My colleagues and I are not expert enough in Medicaid to respond.
Would you be surprised if I told you it would allow them to deny it?
I can try and follow up with some other people.
If Alabama institutes a work requirement under the Act, a young veteran suffering from PSTD in my district could lose his job or her job and cannot find one due to their disorder. They would be dropped from their coverage if my state chooses to waive any essential benefits, as well as the requirement to work is one to just get Medicaid, period. And I guess my concern is if we're really trying to be equal among our veterans,
all time has expired. I would remind the members to question Mr. Bartold about the bill in front of us, which codifies the current existing Obamacare regulations, ensuring veterans who are not using the VA are eligible for the tax credits. Mr. Thompson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under the current law, are tax credits adjusted to take into account different costs of coverage around the country?
The credits are measured relative to premiums for silver plan. So as a general matter, yes.
Under the Republican health care bill that we passed, are tax credits adjusted to take into account different geographic costs?
There's a uniform credit provided that's adjusted by age and by income.
How about geographic? So under the Republican bill, a veteran who lives in a rural area where the cost of coverage is higher will not get any benefit that will be used to help them afford those higher costs?
Again, this legislation doesn't address the amount of credits, but as I noted, the credits are not geographic.
So they wouldn't get any help. Does this bill before us today do anything to address the inequity in the tax credits for veterans living in rural areas?
The legislation before you makes clear that veterans are eligible, that certain veterans are eligible for the premium credits offered under both present law and under the proposed AHCA.
So a veteran in a rural area where the costs are higher would not be helped by this bill?
It does not address an potential issue of geographic variation in price.
So this bill does not provide any additional assistance to veterans living in rural areas who experience higher costs?
That's correct.
Thank you. I want to go back to Ms. Sewell's question on pre-existing conditions. And under the current law, can an individual seeking coverage in the marketplace be denied a policy or charged more because of a pre-existing condition?
Not under the Affordable Care Act, under present law.
So does the bill before us, and the Republican bill repeals the protection that an individual with a pre-existing condition would receive. So does the bill before us today do anything to address this situation?
I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson.
Would the bill before us today do anything to address that situation?
Again, this bill is quite narrow in terms of just making clear that veterans can be eligible for the premium.
So a veteran with a pre-existing condition would not get any help under this bill that we're voting on, marking up today?
This legislation does not address issues related to pre-existing conditions, breaks in coverage, a number of the other provisions of the AHCA.
You know, just for the record, as a veteran myself, most of us have pre-existing conditions, and to hang them out to dry in your last iteration of your health care bill was bad enough, but now to come back and get a second bite of the apple and leave veterans with pre-existing conditions hanging out to dry is pretty sad commentary. Mr. Bartol, according to the last estimate, the Republican health care bill would take health care away from 24 million Americans. Does this bill make any appreciable difference in the coverage loss numbers under the Republican bill that they passed last 2 weeks ago?
By codifying regulations, this bill essentially is making no change in anything related to coverage. As I noted earlier, though, the report...
so here they're coming back with another bill to supposedly improve things, and still 24 million Americans will lose their coverage. I'd like to yield the remaining time to Mr. Doggett.
With the repeal of Obamacare as approved here in the House, which this bill proposes to amend, is there anything to prevent an insurance company from charging a higher premium to a veteran than to a non-veteran?
The legislation before you, Mr. Doggett, does not address that issue.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would beg of my fellow members here to actually read the bill. It's only 2 pages instead of, shall we say, making things up. So let's actually do a quick walk through this. My understanding, Mr. Barthol, right now the VA actually has, what, 8 tiers of ranking, but the bottom 2 tiers do not actually come with medical benefits, medical services.
I'm not exactly sure on the 8 tiers, but yet VA has a number of programs, and they are not all automatically minimum essential coverage.
Okay, so you could actually have an occasion where you're an eligible veteran, but because of where you fell into the ranking, you may actually be one of the tiers, you may actually have something where you're not receiving benefits. My understanding, Ms. Barthol, is there's 25 million theoretically eligible veterans and only 9 million in the VA. So in that case, we actually have a world where the vast majority of those who are veterans are choosing not to use the VA, but yet if they do not sign up for the benefits within 5 years, they do not get the benefits at the VA. Is that correct? All right.
You're more knowledgeable on the
All right, this
the
is
VA
just something
program. Sorry, sir.
we've spent a lot of time on. So for our brothers and sisters, particularly on the left here, don't you want to help the veterans actually be eligible for the tax credits and mechanisms if they've actually chosen not to participate in the VA? You know, I don't understand. And look, let's actually walk through, and this may be, of the 24 million, if you're going to use the language take away, you could actually have some intellectual honesty. If take a look at the CBO number, it was the vast majority of that number were people who are choosing on their own not to purchase. Right now, the ACA, Obamacare as it is, actually has 3 tiers in the community rating. Our replacement bill had 5 tiers because functionally you have an age tax on the young right now, and so the young and healthy are choosing not to purchase, therefore driving up the price for everyone else. The reason you go to 5 tiers is to get some premium pricing efficiency so we can lower everyone's prices. If you're going to be completely duplicitous on your language of, well, they're going to 5 and age tax, be honest and say you have an age tax on the young. I mean, just join a little bit of intellectual honesty here. Pre-existing, stop lying. That's not in the language. We are a guaranteed issue society now. No, let me finish.
Mr. Chairman.
Let me finish.
The member just
No. I've been sitting here. I've been sitting here for my couple months, hearing people make things up.
This member,
and I can actually show you in the language because I spent hundreds of hours on this bill.
Will the gentleman suspend?
Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
Thank you for suspending. The gentleman has not directed his comments to any person specifically or in particular. So the gentleman may proceed.
One more time, our replacement bill is a guaranteed issue bill. There is functionally no such thing as pre-existing condition denying you access. The only thing within that language was if you go more than 63 days without coverage, you can be charged up to a 30% premium and a health rating to the end of the year. And the last one,
You want to be recognized here?
Yeah.
And
the expanding.
Lewis, Joe Bennett.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry for being exasperated, but living in a world where you actually read the document and highlight it and then spend hundreds of hours delving into it and then having this make-believe world that I understand is politically motivated, that puts people on fire, and then you have to sit down with people who come and meet with you who are scared to death because of the left's rhetoric. And then you pull out the legislation and walk them through saying, you're going to have coverage. The mechanics are still there. How can the left be so stunningly cruel to people to make up stories? I understand wanting to win politically, but the cruelty has just been shocking on what the left has been willing to say. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Lewis is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I will yield a minute or so to the ranking member, Mr. Neal.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Lewis, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must tell you, in 25 years on this committee, I've not heard anybody use the word lying, despite the most vociferous commentary that we've offered about specific issues. And I would hope that we might return to that tradition and custom on this committee. Mr. Chairman, entirely unnecessary to question what has been offered and base it on the supposition that it's a lie.
Well, let me just make a comment, Mr. Neal, and obviously you and I have a great relationship. As I said, the gentleman didn't direct his comments to any member specifically or any person specifically. And may I finish, please? I think there is a degree of frustration on this side of the aisle that the gentleman from Arizona conveyed when not necessarily anybody from this committee, but organizations, people who are affiliated on the left, have continued to run TV ads that are misleading at best with respect to people's health care. And I think that frustration has been conveyed not just here, Mr. Neal, but in other parts of this Capitol as well in our districts.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield for a point?
I absolutely will.
All of us have been involved in vigorous campaigns in which we would question the validity of the ads that might have been offered against us. That's very different than sitting in a room here that has an extraordinary historic tradition of the way that we communicate with each other and the terms that we use to describe each other's motives and intentions. That's the choice of words that were used that we would like on this side to not use or to encourage others to refrain from. There's plenty of room for serious discussion, dispute, and disagreement. I think that the position that our side is suggesting is to suggest that we're lying because we find ourselves in disagreement over one of the most fundamental issues in America, and that's the discussion of health care, I think is a very, very different standard that I have not seen utilized in this committee in the time that I've been here.
The gentleman from Georgia controls the time.
Mr. Chairman, is it possible for me to reclaim some of my time?
You can reclaim all of your time. You've got 3 minutes left.
Well, you spoke.
You have a question?
You took some of my time.
The gentleman has 3 minutes.
Mr. Chairman.
Just for the record, we paused it while I was speaking, Mr. Lewis.
The members of this committee have a moral obligation and a mandate to fight for each and every American. I fear we have lost our way. Mr. Neal spoke for me and for all of us. A few weeks ago, I sat in this chair for 18 hours, all night. For 18 hours, I bore witness to the action of the Republicans on this committee. I watched as they passed a bill so dangerous, it had to be hidden from the public and guarded by Capitol Police. All through the night, I saw many empty chairs on the Republican side of the aisle. I could not believe what I saw. If the Republican members have stayed for their hearing, I would tell you what they would have seen. Hours after hours, the Democratic members of this committee offered amendment after amendment and compromise after compromise. Every single offer was rejected. Every single one. We did everything we could to protect health care coverage for the American people. We did everything we could to stop 24 million Americans from losing their coverage. Here we are again. These three bills considered today do nothing to reserve the harms of the Republican health bill. They do nothing for the middle class and working families. They do nothing for families struggling to make ends meet. They do nothing for the men, women, and children who rely on Medicaid for their basic health care needs. Mr. Chairman, there is not a family in this country that has not been touched by illness or injury. That is why decent quality health care must be affordable to every American, whether we're rich or poor, old or young, everyone will need medical need one day. So I must ask again, who will stand for the American people? Who will speak up
for those who have been left out and left behind. This markup is yet another shame and a disgrace to the American people. We can do better. We must have courage, raw courage. I don't see how your president, how Mr. Trump can go off and be in the company of the Pope and bring these type of bills under your leadership to this committee. I consider this budget as cruel and dangerous to the American people. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis, and I have great respect for you, Mr. Lewis, but I will remind you, I sat here in 2009 and 2010 for just as many hours, if not more, when just as many amendments, if not more, were offered by the Republicans to the Affordable Care Act, and not one, not half a one, was accepted. So while I can't project the inflection or the voice that you have or the emotion that you have, at least not until Mr. Pascrell gets me wound up, we respectfully are in disagreement on some of these matters. With that, does anyone wish to strike the last word? The gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. Delbeni, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few questions about how the legislation we're considering today would impact a constituent of mine, Catherine from Woodinville. She told me she purchased health coverage through the Washington State Exchange after suffering a catastrophic car accident. Having health insurance meant she could afford the life-saving medical care that she needed in recovery. And she wrote to me saying, quote, "Without insurance, my care would have ceased. I would not have access to leg braces and orthotics, physical therapy, specialists, or medications. Without the Affordable Care Act coverage, I would be in a wheelchair, unable to ever work or live independently, bankrupt, and sick. The ACA has given me a chance to resume a normal life eventually, and the ACA saves lives," end quote. Catherine is one of 133 million Americans with a pre-existing medical condition. And as you know, the Republican health care bill that passed the House eliminates the guarantee that people can't be charged more for health insurance because they have a pre-existing condition. It also eliminates the guarantee that all health insurance plans must cover 10 essential health benefits, like ER visits and prescription drugs. So, Mr. Bartold, does the legislation we're considering do anything to protect real people, like Catherine, from being charged more for insurance because they have a serious illness or medical condition?
Mr. Balter, you can go ahead and answer, even though we are striking the last word.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman?
You can go ahead and answer the question, even though we're striking the last word.
As I explained earlier, this legislation's at the very narrow issue of veteran eligibility for premium tax credit, so it would not appear to address the situation you described for your constituent.
Well, in that case, does it do anything to protect veterans with a serious illness or medical condition? For example, something like military sexual trauma, from being charged more for insurance because of that condition?
It does not. The legislation does not address pricing or how the credits may vary. Only that the veteran would be eligible for the tax credits provided both under present law and under the AHCA, should the AHCA become law.
Thank you. And essential health benefits, does the bill do anything to prevent states from allowing insurance plans to be sold without coverage for essential services?
This legislation does not amend the proposed the House-passed AHCA with respect to any definition of qualifying health insurance or essential benefits.
Thank you so much. So I think that it's pretty clear there's no question that this bill is woefully inadequate to address the dangerous problems that we see in the Republicans' health care bill and the assault on health care for all Americans. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Levin is recognized.
I'm sorry Mr. Schweikert is left. Mr. Chairman, You used the word respectfully disagree. Using the word lying is the opposite of respect. And I think you owe it to this committee to sit down with Mr. Schweikert and ask him to withdraw. He says he wasn't talking about us. I wonder whom he was talking about. He owes this committee an apology. When all of us think back as to the nature of this committee, as we think back over the years, as we think back over the ability of Republicans and Democrats to work together, if Emil Houghton had been here when Mr. Schweikert talked, I think he probably would have risen and left the room. And I think you have an obligation to tell your members respectfulness is not accusations of lying. And let me just comment on the two provisions that Mr. Schweikert referred to. One was the pre-existing conditions. It isn't only Democrats or liberals or whoever it is who say that when you give states the ability to waive, you essentially are giving them the ability to allow people with pre-existing conditions not to be covered. That's a fact. That's a fact. And for him to essentially say it's lying when we say that the bill you passed could lead to people with pre-existing conditions being out cold, that's not a lie, it's a fact in terms of the ability of states to carry out the waiver. And let me just say something. He objected to the reference to 5-to-1, and essentially we were putting a tax on individuals. The origin of the idea of having an individual mandate came from the state from which Mr. Neal represents. The individual mandate was the proposition of Governor Romney. And it goes back before Governor Romney. It was the original Republican idea. Dole and Nixon. It was the basis for their health care provision. So for Mr. Schweikert, who's now left, to essentially say it's lying, I think is a failure to understand the history of health care. But worse than that, for him to sit in that chair with all of us surrounding him and talking about lying, I think is totally disrespectful of a committee that deserves much more. And I hope that our chairman will take Mr. Schweikert aside if he doesn't do it publicly and say to him, that is not how this committee should proceed or will proceed. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. I'd like to remind all members that under the rules of the House, members may not impugn the motives of other members. Members may not in debate impugn the personal motives of other named members in the performance of their legislative duties, and may not make comments that are personally offensive with regard to the President of the United States. I have provided much leeway to members who have done so today on your side of the aisle.
Who've done what? Who've done what?
May not make comments that are personally offensive with regard to the President of the United States.
Okay, that's no excuse for Mr. Schweikert.
Comment was made with respect to this president and the Pope, and as a Catholic, I was quite offended. So I didn't go there, nor do I want to go there, but I'm reminding all members to de-escalate the comments today. So we can take literally the rules and debate the rules all afternoon if you'd like. I'm trying to provide an avenue to go forward to actually try to legislate on something important to veterans, and I hope that members on both sides of the aisle would prepare to do that going forward.
Mr. Chairman, will
Moving to
you
strike the
de-escalate,
last word.
Mr. Schweiker?
Mr. Blumenauer is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate your offer to try and keep the waters calm. I also understand my colleague from Arizona's frustrations about what is being said in the course of the debate. But with respect to the gentleman who's not here, and I will share with him this information, much of what he is concerned about is not necessarily focused on the people on the left. I have here material that's part of our record of not left-leaning well, maybe you think, but there's a
Would the gentleman like to submit it for the record?
I will submit this for the record.
Without objection.
Coalition of patient advocacy groups, including the American Cancer Society, Heart Association, Lung Association, American Diabetes Association, and March of Dimes, who are deeply concerned about weakening the rules your legislation would enable insurers to charge higher prices to people with pre-existing, possibly making insurance unaffordable for those who need it most, which is why they opposed the American Academy of Pediatrics, American College of Physicians, American Congress of Obstetricians, Gynecologists, National Association of Nurse Practitioners and Women's Health, National Partnership for Women and Families, talking about how supporters of this bill claim that the bill maintained protections for those with pre-existing conditions, but allowing states to waive coverage for essential health benefits and charge people more based on their health status renders the promise of coverage for pre-existing conditions meaningless. I can go on talking about Children's Hospitals Associations, Children's Leadership Council, Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities, Lutheran Services in America, the American Thoracic Society, the American Society of Clinical Oncology. If you listen to those people from your district, as I listen to them for mine, you find out that the devil is in the details, and the details aren't pretty. The details end up making a promise that we heard repeated on the floor time after time. It was empty. There was no substance to back it up. It was other objective sources said that it was categorically a lie. And so there are people who are a little frustrated that somehow the debate sort of skates on people creating an alternative reality when the people who do the work in the health care space time after time said, no, that's not the case. You're not being able to protect those people. Yes, there are millions of people who will not have health care. There will be serious consequences. And saying that everybody has access to health care when you're changing the economics radically and changing the nature of the health care, group after group after group agrees with us that there's some very substantial problems. Gaps in coverage. People who will not be covered regardless of what is said. And we listened on the floor of the House to people making grand claims based on what they wrote in the bill and wished would happen, but the people who work day after day with the reality of the Affordable Care Act and are terrified, frankly, about what would happen if your legislation was enacted, had an entirely different consequence. So it's not just some left-leaning groups that are talking about concern about gaps in coverage, pre-existing condition guarantees that are in words only and won't be there in fact. I want to remind the committee of all of the experts that we have heard before this committee, not people who are from think tanks or theoretical, but the men and women who deliver health care, hospitals, insurance, who deal with the specialties of people with these pre-existing conditions. To the best of my knowledge, they are unanimous in supporting the concerns we have and not supporting the bill that you proposed. And it was just fascinating to me, with all of the debate on the floor, that people just sort of skipped over the reality of the people we hear from in the healthcare arena. It's not just left-leaning politicians. Thank you for your courtesy, and I'll submit this to the record.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. Thank you for your professionalism and your sincerity on this matter. I appreciate your tone. Just two things. One, from my own personal experience, so I'm just talking about me, in my district, TV and radio ads run from the left and the right, lying. I wouldn't vote for the bill that they talked about. Again, didn't say what you said other stuff, and we can respectfully disagree with each other. Two, I'd like to submit for the record, without objection, a letter on behalf of the Paralyzed Veterans of America and one from the Association of the United States Navy, supporting this legislation before us today. In fact, the Paralyzed Veterans of America say this provides, in your own words, a belt and suspenders level of protection for our veterans. Without objection. Mr. Doggett, we're striking the last word. Would you like to be recognized?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I believe there is a lie at the center of this debate, a big misrepresentation. And it's not about what one member calls another or whether one member comments on the misconduct of the president or not. It is the misrepresentation to our veterans across America. As this legislation, in the rush to repeal the Affordable Care Act, went through this committee, all-night session, rushed to the floor when it didn't have to be, veterans did not receive equal treatment. We would not be meeting today and considering this bill had veterans received equal treatment. And so they're coming back today and trying to put a patch on to give veterans equal treatment that they denied at the time they were over in the cheerleading session at the White House with the president. They're trying to fix what they did wrong by our veterans. And the question is there still a misrepresentation that is being made in this Veterans Equal Treatment Bill to veterans across America? Are they really receiving equal treatment today? And my answer is, no, they're not. Before the Affordable Care Act, an insurance company could rate a person to get a higher premium for almost any reason in the world. Taxi drivers sometimes got rated higher, I guess because they sit all day and aren't out walking around and getting exercise, but they could get rated higher and have to pay a higher premium. There is absolutely nothing in this bill, there is nothing in the repeal of the Affordable Care Act that these Republicans celebrated that will prevent an insurance company from charging a veteran more than a non-veteran. There is nothing that will prevent an insurance company in this legislation today or in the underlying repeal that will prevent an insurance company from rating a veteran who has been in a combat zone, whether or not they have been diagnosed as having some impairment, some post-traumatic stress syndromes, or some exposure to toxic substances. There's nothing to prevent them from rating that person at a higher level and charging them a higher premium. And if you think that that is conjecture, then look at the way insurance companies, before the Affordable Care Act put a stop to it, who rated higher or denied coverage as a pre-existing condition a woman who was a victim of domestic violence. That too can now happen again under the Republican approach to health care. Almost anything can be a pre-existing condition or can be a reason to rate someone higher. So every veteran who wants coverage is subject to that in the future under this bill. In addition to that, when our veterans go to war, it is not just the one individual service member who is at war, it's the whole family that gets pulled into this. And this bill does nothing, as did the underlying bill, to afford protection to the families of our veterans, to their children, to their spouses. They are subject to all the pre-existing conditions, to all the higher premiums, to all of the shortcomings associated with the original bill, and that also is not truly equal treatment. Today in America, thanks to the forward-looking views of a number of governors, including some Republican governors, there are 340,000 veterans who benefited from Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. This bill does nothing to assure that those veterans will be able to continue to get their coverage under those state actions as they had in the past, and slashing Medicaid makes it less likely that they'll be able to get this coverage. There are 1.75 million veterans across the country who were so disadvantaged even before the Affordable Care Act that they were covered through the Medicaid program. 105,000 of those are my fellow Texans. They also do not get protection through this act. They will be subject to be victims of the slashing of Medicaid that is so important to their coverage at present. So for all those reasons, I believe that this bill falls short, as did the original bill, rushed through in this fashion because of its many inadequacies, and ought to be rejected for that reason. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. I've got my alter ego on my shoulder here telling me not to engage you right now. But I got to tell you, I strongly disagree with your comments. And I'm going to remind the gentleman that insurance companies under the American Health Care Act are prohibited from denying or not renewing coverage due to a pre-existing conditions. Insurance companies are banned from rescinding coverage based on a pre-existing condition.
Will the gentleman yield?
Insurance companies are banned from excluding benefits based upon a pre-existing
Will the
condition.
gentleman yield?
Period. Insurance companies are prevented from raising premiums on individuals with
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Are you striking the last word, or under
coverage.
what rules of the
Period.
committee are you engaging
You used
in
5
this
minutes,
statement?
Mr. Doggett. I have not used 5 minutes.
So are you
I
striking
am
the last
using my
word?
5 minutes.
Fine. If you're striking
And I'm
the last
trying
word,
to set the record straight.
But you're
and
not.
for the
But
lady
go
in
ahead.
my district, maybe things are rosy in Texas, but the lady in my district, a veteran who lost her coverage on the individual market and has to drive 60 miles to a hospital, lost her hospital, lost her oncologist under Obamacare. So things aren't all that rosy in my district with respect to Obamacare.
Mr. Chairman.
Under my 5 minutes, you'd like me to yield to you, Mr. Neal?
You wouldn't like the result, but if you...
Yeah, I don't think I will. I think I will suspend my comments and recognize the gentle lady from California, striking the last word for 5 minutes, Ms. Chu.
30 seconds?
Yes. I'd like to yield to Mr. Doggett, 30 seconds.
Mr. Tiberi, I would just say that the provisions concerning pre-existing conditions to which you refer in the bill are nothing but a thin veneer to protect politically those who voted for this sorry piece of legislation.
Well, the gentleman
under
yield?
the legislation, not in my 30 seconds, but on your time, I would gladly do so. Under the legislation as it was approved, the sky is the limit in what a veteran who gets their premium increased can be charged, and veterans will get unequal treatment as insurance companies charge them higher rates, treat their veteran service as a pre-existing condition, and there is nothing in your bill that will prevent them being charged for their pre-existing condition. That is the basic flaw of your proposal, to claim you're not restricting pre-existing conditions. You'll just allow them to be charged so much they'll never be able to afford to get coverage. And I thank the gentlewoman for yielding the time.
And I concur with the words of Mr. Doggett. This bill is affixed to the Trump Care bill after the fact. This is an issue that should have been fixed in the original bill, but was kept out of compliance in order to comply with the budget reconciliation rules. On the pre-existing conditions, well, this bill simply builds upon a bill that takes away health care from millions of people, including veterans. Trump Care would allow states to apply for waivers so that insurance companies could once again charge people with pre-existing conditions more. Veterans are especially likely to have pre-existing conditions, which means Trump Care could make health care especially expensive for them. And in addition to that, Trump Care eliminates the requirement that health plans cover essential health benefits like hospitalizations, prescription drugs, and mental health services, all of which veterans rely on. And Trump Care creates an age tax, so older veterans would be forced to pay up to 5 times as much for coverage as younger Americans. And then let's look at the issue of Medicaid. This bill is supporting an underlying bill which slashes Medicaid. Nearly 2 million veterans rely on Medicaid for their health care, which the underlying bill slashes by $838 billion, and the president's budget cuts an additional $600 billion. That's nearly a $1.4 trillion cut from Medicaid total, all to give tax breaks to the rich. Now, the president promised during his campaign that he wouldn't cut Medicaid, but Trump Care and the Trump budget breaks these promises. And for more than 40% of working-age veterans with Medicaid, there is no other source of coverage. So, I believe that this bill should be rejected because the underlying bill should be rejected. And I yield back.
The gentlelady from Kansas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield you some time.
Well, thank you very much. Ms. Chu, in California, the only way, let me just explain this, that in the rare circumstance a person can be charged on health status is a person must reside in a state with an approved waiver and risk management program and have a pre-existing condition. So California would have to request a waiver. The person would have to be uninsured because they've not maintained continuous coverage, and they must be purchasing health care in the individual market, which nationally is less than 8% of the market. Again, for the record, I just like everybody to understand that, because as Mr. Neal knows and Mr. Pasquale knows, I come from pretty humble beginnings, and my mom and dad, they kind of trust people of stature who are members of Congress. And when members of Congress have blank statements on our side or on your side and say things, it's meaningful. It used to be more meaningful, quite frankly, than it is today because of some of the things that are said in this institution over the last several years. And so I just want the record to show, based upon the rhetoric that's coming out of here, that with respect to being able to be charged on health status, let me just say this again, since I have 3 minutes and 40 seconds. A person must reside in a state with an approved waiver, not a proposed waiver, an approved waiver, and a risk mitigation program. They must have a pre-existing condition. They must be uninsured because they have not maintained continuous coverage, and having a dad who was in that circumstance many years ago in high school, I get that could happen. And they must purchase health care in the individual market, which is less than 8% of what Americans get health care insurance coverage in today. So with that, I yield back to the lady from Kansas who controls the time.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield?
I don't control the time. The lady from Kansas does.
Would the gentlelady yield?
No, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Does anyone wish to strike the last word?
Mr. Thompson.
Mr. Thompson, the gentleman from Texas, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. California.
Sorry, I was looking at Mr. Doggett. I'm sorry if I offended you, Mr. Thompson. The gentleman from California.
The gentleman from Michigan doesn't bother me at all.
If you have 30 seconds, yield to him, if you have it left.
Yes. I'll yield 30 seconds to Mr. Levin before I start.
Mr. Chairman, you have just verified what we've been saying. Because are you listening?
Yes.
A waiver can be granted, and that waiver essentially can mean that someone with a pre-existing condition cannot afford to receive insurance. There has to be an interruption of service, but that occurs, according to the facts, often 50% of the time.
So you do agree this is just in the individual market and only in states that request waivers and get approved waivers?
Okay, but it shows the language that says that there will be no penalty for pre-existing condition in your bill is false, because under a waiver, a pre-existing condition essentially can go uninsured. That's a fact. That's a fact.
So
There has to be a waiver. But under this administration, they're indicating they're more than open to waivers. So don't say that your language saying there can be no penalty for pre-existing conditions.
No, I was quite clear, and
Okay.
I'll repeat again.
Yeah,
In the rare exception,
it isn't rare. It's 8
no, it's
million.
very rare. It's very rare.
No, it isn't. It's 8 million people.
No, it's
reclaiming my time.
Okay.
And if I have time left, Mr.
You'll yield it to
I'll
me?
yield back
For
to
you.
I just want to have read into the record a letter I have from the Paralyzed Veterans of America. It was stated that I believe it was stated that this group supports the bill, and that's correct. They do, and you can understand why. They think they got a bum deal on the first bill that you folks passed, and they want to improve it if they can. But I want to point out, and their letter is very clear about this, while they may support this bill that amends a bill that hasn't even left the House yet, they are opposed to your underlying bill. They're opposed to it because they know it's bad for paralyzed veterans. As we heard today, it's bad for many veterans. But I think it's important just to, especially given the fact of the high tension today, that I read the last sentence of this letter. And it ends by saying, Congress should heed these voices, stop its pursuit of the flawed American Health Care Act, and work together through regular order to strengthen all America's access to affordable, high-quality health care. We should heed the remarks of the Paralyzed Veterans of America. These are people who put on a uniform to fight for our freedom and for our democracy. These are people that are paralyzed today, many of them because of their heroic activities. They know this is bad legislation that y'all are trying to fix, and we should come together to try and improve health care for them and for the rest of our constituents. And I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Levin. And I ask unanimous consent for this letter to be read into the record.
Without objection.
Okay, so we will continue, Mr. Tiberi, to spell out. You try to minimize, but it's clear under the legislation that you passed that people with a pre-existing condition could essentially end up without insurance. That's a fact. It may be, it will require a waiver, but this administration is indicating and granting more and more waivers. And also, it's true that then the insurance company can price the policy to the extent that it can't be afforded. That's why Mr. Blumenauer read all of the entities, all of them in the health field, hospitals, AMA, all of those, cancer and the like, who oppose your bill in large measure because it leaves a big hole in terms of pre-existing conditions. That's a fact. I guess it's your time to yield back, Mr. Thompson.
Mr. Thompson, do you yield back? Thank you. Dr. Davis, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, as I listen to the discussion and as I see attempts to make a bad bill better, I'm reminded that you can't cure darkness with darkness. You can't amend a bad bill with provisions and make it a good bill. It's like saying that you can't get blood out of a turnip. You can squeeze it, you can tease it, you can slice it, you can dice it, you can amend it, but you still end up with turnip juice. It's obviously bad for people with pre-existing conditions. It's bad for veterans, and of all people, that we should be making absolutely certain
that we provide the greatest access to health care for are the veterans who have demonstrated that they would give the last ounce of devotion to our country. And so I don't believe that you can make what I call wrong right. It still will be wrong. And because it is, I certainly don't want to vote for it, don't want to ever deny veterans by any stretch of imagination the opportunity to have the best of health care. And I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Nacy, you were recognized.
I was just going to yield back the time to you if necessary.
Well, thank you, sir, very much. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rice, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I am very concerned about health care for our veterans as well. And you know, of course, being from South Carolina, I see what's happened under the Affordable Care Act to our veterans with premiums going up 30% in successive years. They have no real choice of health insurance in South Carolina because there's only one carrier left, and those folks are threatening to pull out of the market, leaving us with none. I'm worried about the veterans in Tennessee and Kentucky and Iowa, who's all in significant portions of those states, all the insurance companies are pulling out. So there's really no choice. They cannot acquire insurance under the Affordable Care Act. I'm worried about veterans that have seen their deductibles rise to $6,000 and more, on top of premiums that have doubled plus in the last few years because, and they may technically have quote unquote coverage, but they can't use it because they can't afford to use it. And so are they really covered at all? I'm worried about veterans in Arizona whose premiums are going up over 100% this year. I'm worried about veterans in Maryland whose premiums are going up by 50%. Exchanges are failing. Many areas in the country have only one insurer. Some have none. So the Affordable Health Care Act, not perfect. Certainly the Affordable Care Act, not perfect. At least the Affordable Health Care Act is sustainable and makes coverage available. And it specifically prohibits insurance companies from charging people with pre-existing conditions any more than anybody else, as long as they keep continuous coverage in any circumstance. It also allows them, it applies a penalty for 1 year of 30% as compared to anybody else if they allow a lapse in coverage. And in the very limited circumstance that a state gets a waiver. But in order to get a waiver, a state has to show that the coverage will be expanded and the premiums will be reduced. The coverage has to be expanded, premiums have to be reduced. So, in the limited circumstance that a state proves that to the federal government and they get a waiver, then for, again, a limited period of time, people with pre-existing conditions can be charged more for 1 year. But they are guaranteed coverage. They are guaranteed the ability to purchase insurance regardless of their pre-existing condition. So, my friends, the Affordable Health Care Act, with its flaws, is a sustainable system. The Affordable Care Act is crumbling before us, leaving thousands, hundreds of thousands, and eventually millions of people without coverage as coverage no longer is available. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Doggett?
Yes. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentleman from Texas recognized for purposes of offering his amendment. Mr. T-Berry?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve point of order.
Point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentleman to suspend while the clerk distributes.
Mine.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, since last September, I've been asking that this committee address the crisis in health care with regard to soaring prescription drug prices. This particular amendment cannot address all of the aspects of the crisis that is affecting one American family after another. Americans that are struggling to purchase life-saving medications are not getting the help that they need. This committee has the responsibility to address this problem, and as best I can determine in surveying the committee and all of its subcommittees since our request that the committee focus some attention on soaring prescription drug prices, the committee has done absolutely nothing. It has been silent. It has refused to consider the impact that the pharmaceutical industry is having in charging what are probably the world's highest prices for prescription drugs, in raising the cost of prescription drugs time and time again. And this is not just one type of prescription drug or one disease. It ranges from the hike that's been immense in the price of insulin that affects so many people with diabetes in the area that I represent in Texas. It affects the many people who cannot afford their drugs with regard to oncology and cancer treatment. It affects EpiPen. It affects just a wide range of prescription drugs that people cannot afford because the price is going up so greatly. The one response that we have had to prescription drugs, and the nearest thing we have had to a debate in this committee, is the decision of the committee, instead of addressing the prescription drug crisis, to reward the price gougers. And this committee approved legislation to give the pharmaceutical industry, and specifically name brand pharmaceuticals, otherwise known as Big Pharma, to give almost $30 billion in a tax windfall to that industry without asking for anything in return. So instead of responding to the problem with prescription drugs, this committee and the majority in the House approved legislation that gave pharma this huge tax windfall for nothing and asked for nothing in return to address the crisis. The bill before us today attempts to correct some of the shortcomings in the bill that the House and this committee approved. It's called the Veterans Equal Treatment Act, and while it doesn't provide veterans equal treatment, as we just discussed, it does provide some correction of the problem, that the deficiency in the original bill. I would suggest that this is an even greater deficiency. And so this bill offers an opportunity to attempt to correct the shortcoming of the bill that the committee approved and address this prescription problem. And it's directly related to this bill because under the legislation that was approved, the effect of taking the $29 billion and giving it to the pharmaceutical companies is to hike the premiums on Part B coverage. The money that came from this pharmaceutical tax went directly into a fund that helped keep the Part B premium under control. And so what I would do is to restore that. And if you don't restore it, you will see Part B premiums rise because the people that are paying Part B premiums who rely on their Medicare, they are going to be paying more because the pharmaceutical companies got a windfall. And our Part B and Part D policies are already deficient, but without this amendment, it will get worse. And I would just suggest that this gets to a matter that is really important to seniors who are relying on Medicare. We heard President Trump say no cuts to Medicare, no cuts to Medicaid, and that he would do something about soaring prescription drug prices. Frankly, I was heartened by that. I didn't agree with him on many other issues, but he finally said, we're going to take on Big Pharma. We're going to do something about this crisis, but the only bill he has endorsed to date, the only action he's endorsed to date, is to approve a $29 million windfall to the pharma folks. I would urge adoption of this amendment to correct one of the glaring inadequacies of the original proposal.
Thank you. All time has expired. Mr. Tiberi.
Mr. Chairman, I'd love to respond, but I think the better part of me thinks I should just make a point of order to the amendment because it's not germane to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because it introduces a new subject matter outside the narrow scope of the Chairman's amendment, which pertains to veterans and the tax credit.
Thank you, Judge. Gentleman offering the amendment wishes to speak on the point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As I have commented in the questions to Mr. Barthold and in the comments on the underlying bill, many, many veterans are impacted by what we're doing here and will be impacted on the cost of prescription drugs. Of course, many veterans benefit from the Veterans Administration program where they can get their prescription drugs at an affordable price. What I would like to see in place is a measure similar to that so that the rest of Medicare beneficiaries can get their prescription drugs at an affordable price. But there are some veterans that don't qualify for that Veterans Administration program, and they get the brunt of prescription price gouging like everyone else. So I think this is a measure that is appropriate for this bill because of its impact on veterans, and it is appropriate because this bill before us, the Veterans Equal Treatment Act, is trying to correct one of the many deficiencies in the original repeal of the Affordable Care Act, and this is a glaring deficiency that demands correction. And it is the only opportunity, given your refusal, Mr. Chairman, to even conduct a hearing on prescription price gouging. It's the only opportunity we have to raise this issue and try to see that at least Part B premiums don't get hiked because the Big Pharma has received this unjustified windfall of $29 billion. And I thank you for the opportunity to comment on the point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. I am prepared to rule the amendment is not germane to the amendment in nature of substitute because it does violate House Rule 16, Clause 7 by introducing a new subject matter outside the scope of my amendment in the nature of a substitute, the excise tax on pharmaceuticals.
And, Mr. Chairman, on that, I would appeal the ruling of the chair.
The point of order, sustained amendment is not in order.
I move to table the appeal.
Mr. Doggett appeals the ruling. Mr. Tiberi moves the table. Questions on the motion table the appeal of the chair's ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion
Mr. Chairman, on that, I request a record vote.
The clerk, a recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Nunes? Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Tiberi? Mr. Tiberi, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Aye. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Aye. Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri?
Aye.
Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? No. Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Delbene? No. Ms. Delbene, no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Johnson? Ms. Black? Aye. Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Kind? Mr. Pascrell? No. Mr. Pascrell, aye. Or, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 yeas, 15 nays.
There being 23 ayes and 15 noes, motion to table is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Thompson is recognized for purposes of offering his amendment. Mr. Teaberry?
I reserve point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentleman to suspend while the clerk distributes. Mr. Thompson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we've all heard from folks on the dais as well as outside groups who are concerned about the impact of the Republican health care bill, some of the deleterious effects of that bill. And one that is particularly disturbing to a lot of the people that we all represent on both sides of the dais is the fact that the Republican health care bill robs $75 billion and 2 years of solvency from the Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund. This has people understandably worried. We know that the bill was more about tax cuts than it was about health care, and I think that this particular provision is emblematic of that. The bill that you all passed took money, gave a tax cut to the richest Americans, and took that money from seniors who rely on their Medicare. This amendment eliminates that tax cut for America's wealthiest families that is, in fact, paid for by seniors. The Republican health care bill that passed the House would reduce federal revenues, as I said, by $75 billion. This is a hugely regressive cut, and it would disproportionately benefit the wealthiest Americans in the country. Nearly 2/3 of the benefits go to millionaires who would get an average tax cut of $13,700 each. And again, paid for by the seniors that we represent. I would yield the remaining time to Mr. Larson.
Well, I thank the gentleman from California, and I'll use this time, Mr. Chairman, to introduce for the record an article carried in the venerated Wall Street Journal. Little noted provision of the GOP health care bill could alter employer plans. It's stunning, but when you read through it, some very good reporting on how, in fact, even employer plans, where 50% of the nation is insured, could, because of the way this bill was written, would give employers added flexibility to take steps that could lower costs by limiting more expensive coverage areas. And it would lessen the federal regulation of insurers, a goal many of the GOP lawmakers who believe the ACA is an example of government overreach would achieve. So I want to submit this letter because it does put so many other Americans at jeopardy with this unwise and hastily written piece of legislation. And with that, I'll yield back to the gentleman from California.
Without objection.
I yield back to the balance of my time.
All right, Mr. Tiberi. Can you hit that?
Sorry, I make a point of order to the amendment because it is not germane to the amendment in the nature of substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because it introduces a new subject, the additional 0.9% Medicare tax. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Tiberi. Does the gentleman offering the amendment wish to speak on the point of order?
I just want to point out to my colleagues on the committee that this protects seniors who depend upon their Medicare, and veterans are seniors as well. Veterans aren't just less than Medicare age, and I would ask that you consider favorably this amendment.
Thank you. I am prepared to rule the amendment is not germane to the amendment in the nature of substitute because it violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, by introducing subject matter that's beyond the scope of this narrow bill addressing veterans. A point of order is sustained and is not in order. Mr. Thompson appeals the ruling in the chair. Mr. Tiberi moves to table the appeal.
Mr. Chairman, I move to table the chair.
Thank you. The questions on the motion to table the appeal of the chair's ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion tabled is agreed to. Mr. Thompson seeks a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson, Mr. Nunes, Mr. Tiberi, Mr. Tiberi votes aye. Mr. Reichert votes aye. Mr. Roscom votes aye. Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Smith in Nebraska votes aye. Ms. Jenkins votes aye. Mr. Paulson votes aye. Mr. Marchant, Ms. Black, Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Renacci votes aye. Mr. Meehan votes aye. Ms. Noem Ms. Nome votes aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding votes aye. Mr. Smith? Aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert votes aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski votes aye. Ms. Corbello? Mr. Corbello? Aye. Mr. Corbello votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Neal? No. Mr. Neal votes no. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Lewis? No. Mr. Lewis votes no. Mr. Doggett? No. Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer? No. Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kind? No. Mr. Kind votes no. Mr. Pascrell? No. Mr. Pascrell votes no. Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley votes no. Mr. Davis? No. Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Del Bene? Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Nunez? Aye. Mr. Nunez votes aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Marchant? Aye. Mr. Marchant votes aye. Ms. Black? Aye. Ms. Black votes aye. Ms. Del Bene? Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady votes aye.
Chairman? Yes. How is Ms. Sanchez recorded?
Ms. Sanchez is recorded no.
Is that correct, Ms. Sanchez? Clerk will report the vote.
23 ayes, 15 nays.
There being 23 ayes and 15 noes, the motion to table is agreed to. Mr. Higgins, for what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
To offer an amendment on the...
Great. The gentleman from New York is recognized for purposes of offering his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Mr. T. Berry, a point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentleman to suspend while the clerk distributes. Mr. Higgins, you are recognized for purposes of offering your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment ensures that veterans are not subject to the age tax. According to analysts of the Republican health care bill, 26 million people will lose their health care, and premiums for those between the ages of 60 and 64 would increase by an average of $3,200 a year, amounting to average unsubsidized premiums of almost $18,000 per year. There is a provision as it relates to veterans' health care. To qualify for an insurance tax credit, you can't be eligible for other low-cost government health care, like Veterans Administration care. If you're a vet who's eligible to get treated at the Veterans Hospital, you wouldn't qualify for tax credits on the private health insurance market. This would affect approximately 7 million veterans. And while technical efforts were made to change the language of the bill, that language was stripped out in the final version because of concerns about the reconciliation process and the inclusion of language. So this would correct that and restore tax credits used by veterans to purchase health care coverage that uses the age rating of the Affordable Care Act. Then I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Higgins yields back. Mr. Teaberry.
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order to the amendment because it's not germane to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The amendment violates House rules because the amendment falls in the jurisdiction of the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Mr. Teaberry raised a point of order. Does Mr. Higgins wish to speak on the point of order?
Well, this is a committee of jurisdiction. We went through all 126 pages of the bill. There is a tax implication, and it relates to veterans. I don't think that the exclusion of these 7 million veterans was intentional, but they got caught up in the technicality of the bill, and I think we have an obligation to them in the realm of fairness to correct this by approving this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. I am prepared to rule the amendment is not germane amendment in nature substitute because it violates House rule by falling in the committee jurisdiction of another committee. Point of order is sustained. The amendment is not in order. Are there further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Dr. Davis, you're recognized. For what purposes, gentlemen, seek recognition?
Amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Mr. Teaberry, a point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentleman to suspend while the clerk distributes. Dr. Davis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have extreme concerns that the bill may erode the current health care protections enjoyed by low-income families. My amendment is a common-sense safety measure. If the Republican proposal causes costs to go up for those who earn less than 400% of the federal poverty level, my amendment simply adjusts the tax credit so that hard-working veterans will pay no more than 10% of the premium costs for comprehensive quality health insurance. If we can give billions of dollars in tax breaks to the wealthiest and most secure, Surely we can enact a safety provision to help cover any increased costs for those who earn 400% of the poverty level. Offering tax credits to veterans without seeing the broader need and recognizing the challenges that many of them face every day with homelessness, high unemployment, mental disabilities, drug addiction, and poverty is a shame. There are almost 1.5 million veterans that live in poverty in the United States between the ages of 18 and 34 years old. This age group has the highest poverty rate among veterans. We should do everything within our congressional authority to provide affordable and quality health care for veterans as well as for low-income families. Current law supports these families, and I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Davis, anyone wish to speak on the amendment? Dr. Davis, if I may, I think there's wonderful intentions on this amendment. I would make the case right now under the current Affordable Care Act, veterans have seen a doubling of their premiums under Obamacare, and in many cases have no choices at all for coverage. I know none of us want to see that happen. The American Health Care Act includes over $138 billion to assist in providing coverage and lowering costs for patients, including veterans. This includes $100 billion to help states to establish high-risk pools, including for veterans, help them cut out-of-pocket costs, promote more choices for our veterans and others, and increase the number of options that they have, including risk-sharing the cost to lower their premiums. We also include $15 billion to establish a federal invisible risk-sharing program that helps the current veterans on Obamacare through this next 3-year transition. We know their costs continue to skyrocket under the existing Obamacare plan. We also include another $15 billion to help states deal with issues like mental health care and substance abuse disorders, which regrettably our veterans can sometimes face. And so while I agree in a bipartisan way that we do all that we can for our veterans, the bill that has passed the House provides ample resources for states to address specifically their needs. Does anyone else wish to speak on Dr. Davis's amendment? Question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Dr. Davis. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Are there additional amendments to the amendment?
Chairman,
the nature of us?
I ask for a recorded vote.
Yes, sir. Dr. Davis has asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson, Mr. Nunez, Mr. Tieberry, Mr. Tieberry, no. Mr. Reichert, Mr. Reichert, no. Mr. Roscom, Mr. Roscom, no. Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Smith of Nebraska, Mr. Smith, no. Ms. Jenkins, Ms. Jenkins, no. Mr. Paulson, Mr. Paulson, no. Mr. Marchant, Mr. Marchant, no. Ms. Black, Ms. Black, no. Mr. Reed, Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Renacci, Mr. Renacci, no. Mr. Meehan, Mr. Meehan, no. Ms. Nome, Ms. Nome, no. Mr. Holding, Mr. Holding, no. Mr. Smith of Missouri, Mr. Smith, no. Mr. Rice, Mr. Rice, no. Mr. Schweikert, Mr. Schweikert, no. Ms. Walorski, Ms. Walorski, no. Mr. Corbello, Mr. Corbello, no. Mr. Bishop, Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Neal, Mr. Neal, aye. Mr. Levin, Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, yes. Mr. Doggett?
Aye.
Mr. Doggett, aye. Mr. Thompson?
Aye.
Mr. Thompson, aye. Mr. Larson? Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Kind?
No.
Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley?
Aye.
Mr. Crowley, aye. Mr. Pascrell?
Aye.
Mr. Pascrell, aye. Mr. Davis? Aye. Mr. Davis, aye. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, aye. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, aye. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, aye. Ms. Del Bene? Ms. Del Bene, aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, no. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, no. Mr. Larson?
Yes.
Mr. Larson, aye. Mr. Blumenauer? Chairman Brady.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman?
Just on the amendment itself?
Chairman Brady?
No.
Chairman Brady, no.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
How was Mr. Kind recorded?
Mr. Kind is recorded as aye.
I
that
thought
accurate?
I was appealing your ruling, Mr. Chair. I guess I was mistaken. I'd like to vote no. Oh, no, we want to vote aye. I was recorded as aye. We're going to stick with aye.
We've all done this before, Mr. Kind. So, Mr. Blumenauer.
Times now.
It happens to me all the time. Mr. Blumenauer. How's Mr. Blumenauer recorded?
Mr. Blumenauer is not recorded.
How do you wish to be recorded? With Mr. Kind? Thank you.
Mr. Blumenauer?
That would be an
Mr.
aye.
Blumenauer, aye.
Where's
Del Bene.
The clerk will report the vote.
16 yeas, 23 nays.
There being 16 ayes and 20 noes, the amendment is not agreed to. Ms. Delveni, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentlelady is recognized for purpose of offering her amendment. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Nunez?
I reserve a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
The point of order has been reserved by Mr. Nunez. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentlelady to suspend while the clerk distributes. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment eliminates one of the most deeply concerning parts of the Republican health care bill, the provision allowing insurance companies to once again discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions. This provision was added to the bill at the last minute, behind closed doors, to appease an extreme group of members of Congress. It took an already dangerous piece of legislation and took it from bad to worse. It's just another broken promise from President Trump and Speaker Ryan, who repeatedly committed to protecting Americans with pre-existing conditions. What's worse, that's not all the provision does. It also allows older Americans to be charged astronomically higher prices for health care, even more than the $3,200 average age tax in the underlying bill. And it undermines the guarantee that all health insurance policies cover essential health benefits like prescription drugs, mental health services, opioid addiction treatment, and maternity care. As almost any woman would tell you, it's laughable that maternity care might not be considered an essential part of health care. Finally, the provision threatens to bring back annual and lifetime limits on health care, which are applied only to essential health benefits. That means if a state decides to remove prescription drugs as an essential health benefit, insurance companies could cap the amount it covers for cancer drugs or insulin or HIV medications. Or they could decide not to cover medications at all. This is patently unacceptable. Not only is it inhumane, but it also does nothing to address the real problems our constituents are facing. We may disagree on how to strengthen the individual market or help small businesses afford the cost of coverage, but we should all be able to agree that it's wrong to price people out of coverage because they have cancer or arthritis or any other serious illness. This is not theoretical. We know that before the Affordable Care Act, 43 states and the District of Columbia allowed insurance companies to charge higher premiums to people with pre-existing conditions. And if we turn back the clock now, the costs would be enormous. According to one estimate, the Republican health care bill means diabetes patients would pay $5,500 more in premiums. Rheumatoid arthritis patients, like my mother, would pay $26,000 more. Breast cancer patients would pay $28,000 more. And severe oncology patients, like those suffering from lung and brain cancer, would pay a staggering $71,000 more each year. I'm fighting back against this dangerous assault for thousands of my constituents who would be affected, like Christine from Kirkland, who is born with a congenital heart defect and requires an expensive defibrillator to stay alive. She has undergone 7 different surgeries in her life, and at age 25, she has already used $600,000 of her $1 million lifetime limit. She told me, quote, "I used to cry myself to sleep thinking about the bankruptcy I would inevitably face just to stay alive once I hit that limit. Those fears are all went away when the Affordable Care Act became law," end quote. We heard a similar story from Jimmy Kimmel earlier this month when his son was also born with a congenital heart defect. He was right when he said, quote, "No parent should ever have to decide if they can afford to save their child's life," end quote. I hope that all of my colleagues can support this amendment for families like Jimmy's and Christine's and so many others. Our nation cannot go back to a time when Americans with pre-existing conditions found it virtually impossible to find affordable quality coverage through no fault of their own. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote yes, and I yield the remainder of my time to Ms. Chu.
I would like to thank Ms. Delbene for offering this very important amendment. Just a few weeks ago, when the House was about to pass Trump Care, my constituent Kate called my office worried for her son who was born with muscular dystrophy and is now 1 year old. Kate explained that because of her son's condition, he will need care for the rest of his life. But without the ban on pre-existing conditions, the cost of insurance for her son will be well beyond what she and her husband can afford. She is paralyzed with fear about how she's going to be able to care for him as he grows older. This amendment will prevent insurance companies from discriminating against families like Kate's for having children with pre-existing conditions. Health insurance is not a privilege, it's a right, and having a child with a pre-existing condition should not doom a family to bankruptcy. I strongly support my colleague Ms. Delbene's amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to vote yes.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes.
Mr. Chairman, it appears to me like the new health care bill does allow us people to get insurance and keep with pre-existing conditions. But I want to make a point of order on that amendment because it is not germane to the amendment in nature of a substitute. The amendment violates House rule because it introduces the jurisdiction of the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Thank you. Does the gentlelady offering the amendment wish to speak on the point of order?
I do, Mr. Chair. First, Mr. Chair, I'd like to yield time to Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, and thank you for this amendment. Coincidentally, just as you began to present your amendment, I was meeting with a group of physicians from the American College of Physicians, including a pediatric cardiologist. And it's pretty clear that Jimmy Kimmel is not the only family that has this problem of a child born with a pediatric cardiology problem. And your amendment goes directly to trying to correct this problem. I don't think in a bill that makes corrections to the very deficient bill that the House passed, we should pass on an opportunity to get, well, I don't intend any pun here, but to get to the heart of the problem. And I think particularly of a woman named Nita who contacted me recently. She lives just outside of Austin, and she had a baby born with a heart defect. She stayed in the hospital. You can imagine how this tears at the family night and day with her baby, waiting for him to grow strong enough to endure surgery and to close the hole between the lower chambers of his heart. Her husband's insurance told her during this time that it would not cover her baby's treatment because his heart problems, the problems he was born with, counted as a pre-existing condition. This is what happened before the Affordable Care Act dealt with these problems. And she contacted me to tell me the story because she said, we cannot give up. We have to keep fighting to ensure that people aren't priced out on pre-existing conditions. You can write language in a bill that says you can't prevent pre-existing conditions, but when you price people out of the market, they will be effectively denied because of their pre-existing conditions. So for people like Nita and her baby, thank you for doing this, and I think it's very germane to this discussion.
And reclaiming my time, Mr. Chair, we need to do everything possible to deal with the consequences of the underlying legislation. My amendment would play an important role in making changes that I've heard from my constituents they need, people who are concerned about losing access to health care and not being able to afford health care if they have a pre-existing condition. So I urge you to support the amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. I am prepared. The rule amendment to which factcheck.org has said insurers would still be required to offer plans to anyone, regardless of pre-existing conditions, isn't germane to the amendment in nature substitute, because it violates House rules by amending the Public Services Act, which is not in our jurisdiction. The point of order is sustained. Amendment is not in order.
Mr. Chair, I appeal the rule.
Mr. Nunes moves to table the appeal. Chair is on the question of motion to table the appeal. Chair is ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those no.
No.
Any Chair, the ayes have it. The motion tabled to is agreed to.
Mr. Chair, I asked for a recorded vote.
Yes, Ms. Delbany asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll. Got time.
Mr. Johnson, Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Teaberry, Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom, Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska, Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black, Mr. Reed, Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci, Mr. Meehan, Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri, aye. Mr. Rice, Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson, No. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Teaberry?
Aye. Aye.
Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
Clerk will report the vote.
22 ayes, 16 noes.
There being 22 ayes and 16 noes, the motion to table is agreed to. Ms. Sanchez, for what purpose does you seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for purposes offering her amendment. Mr. Nunes?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentlelady to suspend while the clerk distributes. The gentlelady is recognized, from California, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I feel like we've traveled back in time to March, and I can't believe that we're here to vote on another round of Trump Care amendments. But here we are again, and here I am again, introducing an amendment that is based on legislation I authored back in 2009. Nearly 8 years ago, I introduced the bipartisan Gender Equity in Health Premiums Act with our former Republican colleague from Florida, Ginny Brown-Waite. Our bill prohibited health insurance companies from engaging in a practice called gender rating, in which they charge women more for health insurance premiums than men for the same policy. And that amendment, I'm happy to say, was included in the Affordable Care Act, which banished that practice. Back then, I said, quote, "Never again will a woman be denied insurance or charged 1.5 times the amount of a man simply because she is a woman." Well, ladies, apparently I was wrong. On May 4th, 2017, the Republican-controlled House has brought us back to the obsolete policies of the past. I know Republicans like to say, "Take America back," but I didn't think you wanted to take America this far back. In 2009, women had the most to gain from healthcare reform. Today, under the provisions laid out by the AHCA, women have the most to lose. Back then, there were only 4 women on this committee. Today, there are twice as many, a whopping total of 8 of us. Can't we all agree that charging women higher premiums just because we are women is wrong? Surely what was wrong in 2009 is still wrong today. Let me just quote what Ginny Brown Waite said in 2009. Quote, "It is ludicrous that in this day and age, insurance companies can charge women more simply for being women. That is the very definition of discrimination, and it must end. As the healthcare reform debate rages on, this is an important fix that can make a real difference now." End quote. If you vote against this amendment again, I don't know how you'll be able to look your wives or your daughters or your granddaughters in the eye and tell them that you honestly thought this was the better way. I urge all of my colleagues, but especially my female sisters in arms, let's not take a step backwards on our health. I implore you not to allow health insurance companies to charge women more for their health care for the second time this year. Please support this common sense amendment. Let's not roll back the progress that we have made. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes.
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order to the amendment because it is not germane to the amendment in nature of a substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because it goes beyond the narrow subject matter of the tax credit for veterans.
Thank you. Does the gentlelady offering the amendment wish to speak on the point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Clearly, this is a committee of jurisdiction. This was an amendment that was offered under the Affordable Care Act. I believe that it is germane to the healthcare discussion that we are having now. If we are going to open up the Republican Trump Care bill for amendments, I think that this is an amendment that makes rational sense, and I think that it is very much germane, especially in the lives of women. And I would like to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Ms. Sanchez for yielding time, and I simply express strong support for her amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Does the gentlelady yield? Balance? Thank you. So I am prepared to rule the amendment isn't germane to the amendment in nature substitute because it violates House Rule 16, Clause 7 by going beyond the narrow subject matter of veterans in the context of the tax credit. The point of order is sustained. Amendment is not in order.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to appeal the ruling of the chair.
Ruling is appealed. Mr. Nunes moves to table the appeal. Questions on the motion table the appeal. The chair's ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
And chair, the ayes have it. The motion table is agreed to. A roll call vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Nunes? Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Aye. Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Aye. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Aye. Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? No. Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Kind? No. Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? No. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis? No. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? No. Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Blumenauer? Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
22 yeas, 15 nays.
There being 22 ayes and 15 noes, the motion to table is agreed to. Ms. Sewell, for what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentlelady is recognized for purposes of offering her amendment. Mr. Nunes?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask gentlelady to suspend while the clerk distributes. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is quite simple. It prohibits states from imposing work requirements as permitted under Trump Care on any veteran in order for him or her to access Medicaid benefits. Mr. Chairman, our veterans have already worked hard enough on our behalf and have proven themselves worthy of the care they deserve when they return home. We should be ever cognizant of the internal and external wounds that often come with military service and our obligation to ensure that our policies cover all of the health care services those that are wounded require for proper healing. It is unacceptable that Trump Care, in the name of flexibility, excludes assistance for veterans and gives states the option to waive essential health care benefits such as mental health services. We should also be aware that the wounds that come with military service often pose barriers to veterans returning to the job that they are trained in when they return home. Finding a job that adapts to their new reality can often be difficult, particularly for those in rural America where jobs are scarce and career options are less diverse. It can often take months and years to find a career that fits their new needs and qualifications. Trump Care gives states the option to impose work requirements on Medicaid beneficiaries. Proponents of work requirements argue that those who don't work aren't worthy of assistance and that they shouldn't be subsidized for what they deem as laziness. But this doesn't translate well when we consider our veterans, particularly those who suffer from PTSD and similar illnesses, who have served our country. For wounded veterans who are not technically disabled, a work requirement can be detrimental. It is unacceptable that Trump Care does not exclude those who have served our country from such a work requirement if demanded by a state. My amendment would address this issue and by exempting our nation's heroes from the work requirement. I hope that all of my colleagues will vote yes on this important amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
So, Mr. Nunes, recognize.
Point of order to the amendment because it is not germane to the amendment nature of substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because it is outside the committee's jurisdiction.
Does the gentlelady offering the amendment wish to speak on the point of order?
I would. Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, the title of this bill, 2872, is Veterans Equal Treatment Ensures Relief and Access Now Act. What could be more fair than ensuring that our veterans, our nation's heroes, have access to health care that they have earned? That's simply what this amendment does, and I would encourage everyone to vote for it.
Thank you. I am prepared to rule the amendment is not germane amendment in the nature of substitute because it violates House rules by making changes outside of this committee's jurisdiction. The point of order is sustained. Amendment is not in order. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell appeals ruling the chair. Mr. Nunes moves to table the appeal. Questions on the motion to table the appeal of the chair's ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Motion to table is agreed to. Ms. Sewell requests recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson, Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Tiberi, aye. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska, Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant, Ms. Black, Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri, Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis, Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer, Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez, Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Del Bene, no. Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Marchant, yes. Ms. Black, Mr. Smith of Missouri, Mr. Smith, yes. Mr. Lewis, Mr. Blumenauer, Ms. Sanchez? Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
22 yeas, 13 nays.
There being 22 ayes and 13 noes, the motion to table is agreed to. Ms. Chu, for what purposes does the gentlelady seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentlelady is recognized for purposes of offering her amendment. Mr. Nunes?
That's for a point of order.
Point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentlelady to suspend while the clerk distributes. Gentlelady is recognized on her amendment.
Mr. Chair, I think it's absolutely critical that we address the incredible need for mental health services among all populations, but especially for veterans. My amendment would make sure that mental health services are not put out of reach by artificially high premiums or out-of-pocket costs. It would require that the qualified health plans purchased with a tax credit under the American Health Care Act include mental health, behavioral health, and substance abuse treatment benefits. Mental health treatment saves lives. It's as simple as that. I know this because long before I became involved in government, I was a clinical psychologist. I saw patients who had issues with drug abuse and addiction, patients who were victims of rape and domestic violence, and patients who were suicidal. These patients have stayed with me, and every time I hear a new debate over whether plans should cover mental health services, I think of their stories. And I'm especially concerned that this bill, which seeks to give additional health care access to veterans, does not address this gaping hole in coverage. I've spoken to countless veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan who are haunted each and every day by the memories of warfare. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, stays with these young men and women every day, at times for the rest of their lives. For some, this means difficulty leaving the house. For others, this means the sound of loud noises like fireworks can feel life-threatening. According to a 2015 survey from the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, 58% of participating veterans reported having a mental health issue as a direct result of their service. Another study from JAMA Psychiatry found the rate of PTSD among veterans to be 15 times higher than civilians. And according to the Department of Veterans Affairs, suicide rates are 41% higher than the general population for deployed veterans and 61% higher than the general population for non-deployed veterans. So imagine a veteran returning home from several tours overseas. He just got a new job, but he doesn't make a lot of money yet, so he relies on tax subsidies to help him purchase insurance through the exchanges. Right now, his health insurance plan covers his trips to the therapist, who is helping him deal with depression that he may be suffering as a result of his service. With this benefit, he's able to hold down jobs so he can pay his bills and put food on the table. But he's terrified that if the AHCA becomes law, he won't be able to see his therapist anymore, which means he won't be able to maintain his performance at work. This could result in this veteran losing his job altogether. So then he's worried that without the mental health treatments he currently receives, he won't be able to afford his rent any longer, and that eventually he'll become homeless. But instead of addressing the dire need for mental health services for this vulnerable population, the underlying bill that H.R. 2372 amends would allow insurers to offer plans without essential health benefits, including mental health benefits. What's worse, it would permit insurers to charge people with pre-existing conditions, like, for example, PTSD, and charge them more for coverage. According to the Center for American Progress, premiums for individuals with major depressive disorders would increase by 208%, or approximately $8,490 per year under the AHCA. This means that even if veterans could find a plan that covers mental health services, it would be impossible to afford. Our men and women in uniform put their lives on the line for us. We cannot abandon them when they return home. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Nunes?
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order to the amendment because it's not germane to the amendment and the nature of substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because it is broader than the narrow scope of this bill.
Thank you. Does the gentlelady offering the amendment wish to speak on the point of order?
Yes, as I said, 58% of veterans reported suffering from mental health issues as a direct result of their service. Since this bill deals with veterans' access to health care, I believe that the amendment is very germane.
Thank you. I am prepared to rule the amendment is not germane. The amendment in nature substitute as it violates House Rule 16, Clause 7 by making changes that are beyond the scope of the narrow bill. The point of order is sustained. Amendment is not in order. Ms. Chu, do you?
I appeal the ruling of the chair.
So Ms. Chu appeals ruling chair. Mr. Nunes moves to table. Questions on the motion table to appeal the chair's ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion table.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Agreed to.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Ms. Chu seeks recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson. Mr. Nunes. Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Teaberry. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska. Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci. Mr. Meehan. Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome. Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding. Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski. Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo. Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Thompson. Oh, Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley. Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez. Mr. Higgins. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Del Bene. Ms. Del Bene, no. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Johnson. Ms. Black. Mr. Renacci. Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Blumenauer. Ms. Sanchez. Chairman Brady.
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
Clerk will report the vote.
22 yeas, 12 nays.
There being 22 ayes and 12 noes, motion to table is agreed to. What purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Bill?
Mr. Pascrell?
Bill?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to offer
Gentleman
an
is-
amendment.
Yes, sir. Gentleman in New Jersey is recognized for purposes of offering this amendment. Mr. Nunes?
That's for point of order.
Point of order has been reserved. Clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentleman to suspend while the clerk distributes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We still had money TBI. They're so concerned about this, and they're going to cut money for the signature injury.
Let them see what I have to say. Hear what I have to say.
Although that is a hot mess. This is the Czech Republic, isn't it?
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would allow individuals who suffer from traumatic brain injuries to maintain their current tax credits under the ACA. Mr. Chairman, this body, in a bipartisan fashion in 2007, with the great help of former Congressman Jack Murtha of Pennsylvania, passed legislation for the first time 5 years after the war started to put money into the budget, into the Defense Department, to start to address the issue of traumatic brain injury, which was the signature injury of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. We'd prefer, of course, this amendment would allow individuals who suffer from traumatic brain injuries to maintain their current tax credits under the ACA. We'd prefer, of course, that no one have to be subject to the tax hikes included in the AHCA. But if this is what Republicans are intent on doing, perhaps you could make some exemptions. As many of you know, I'm the co-chair and the co-founder of the Congressional Brain Injury Task Force, and working on this issue for over 17 years. TBI is that signature injury. And many of our veterans are grappling with the consequences of these injuries, which many of us are just discovering. Estimates from the RAND Corporation in 2008 estimated that nearly 20%, or 320,000, of the 1.6 million men and women deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan sustained a brain injury while in the line of duty. Over the years, Many of us have advocated for policies that improve the prevention, the diagnosis, and of course the treatment of TBI. More than 5 million Americans are living with a lifelong disability as a result of a TBI, and individuals that sustain moderate and severe TBIs require substantial medical care to recover and cope with these injuries. Access to the supports and services that they need to return to school and work and continue with their everyday lives often results in a significant out-of-pocket cost even with health coverage. TBI survivors cannot afford to lose their insurance, nor can they afford any additional costs. Under the Republican health care plan, we know that millions will lose health coverage, and even more will be subject to higher cost sharing and inadequate coverage. It concerns me. And if concerns about the impact of the AHCA wasn't enough, yesterday, in this budget, the one that was handed to us yesterday, which would raise alarm bells across our healthcare system. Take a look at the budget. Those of us who mouth about veterans and are going to stand for these cuts that have never occurred since 2007, we've increased that pool of money. Why? Because so many are affected. For the past 17 years, the federal TBI state grant program has supported state efforts to address the needs of persons with brain injury and their families. It has helped expand and improve services to underserved and unserved populations, including young people, veterans and returning troops, and individuals with co-occurring conditions. This was a $9 million program, a drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of the federal budget. With $9 million, this program was only able to support grants in 18 states, meaning that with that level of funding, we weren't coming close to reaching everyone in need. The Trump budget, who's ever put their name on the darn thing, the Trump budget cut this program by 2/3. On behalf of those affected by TBI and their families, I urge the passage of this amendment. I think it's important to understand, let me go back to what I said before, Republicans are intent of doing, perhaps we could make some exemptions. I think this is a perfect exemption. I think it is germane, and as Americans and as patriots that we all are, or profess to be, we should stand up for our veterans, particularly with the signature injury of the war we sent them to.
Thank you, Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Nunes?
I make a point of order to the amendment because it is not germane to the amendment nature of a substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because it is broader than the narrow scope of this bill.
Does the gentleman offering the amendment wish to speak on the point of order?
No, I think the objections to my presenting this bill speak for themselves. I will not respond to that claptrap.
Thank you, sir. I am prepared to rule the amendment is not germane amendment nature substitute because it violates House Rule 16, Clause 7 by making changes that are beyond the scope of the narrow bill. The point of order is sustained. Amendment is not in order. Mr. Pascrell, do you appeal the ruling of the chair? Mr. Nunes?
I move to table, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Nunes? Yes, sir. Moves to table the appeal. Questions on the motion to table the appeal. The chair's ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion table is agreed to. A roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson. Mr. Nunes. Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Teaberry. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Roscom. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding,
Aye.
Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri, Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis, Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer, Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez, Mr. Higgins, Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Del Bene, no. Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Reichert, yes. Mr. Smith of Nebraska, yes. Ms. Black, Mr. Lewis, Mr. Blumenauer, Ms. Sanchez, Mr. Higgins, Chairman Brady.
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
22 yeas, 12 nays.
There being 22 ayes and 12 noes, motion to table is agreed to. The committee will stand in recess subject to the call of the chair. We expect to reconvene this evening after the second series of floor votes.